This video is brought to you by my current inability to leave the house. Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now, I love old PC games. In fact, my collection is primarily made up of disc-based titles that, in hindsight, I'm glad I bought because they're not all available on digital stores like Steam or GOG these days. You know, it's a bit of a pain, and an external CD drive isn't the most aesthetically pleasing thing to sit on top of someone's desk, but it does allow me to play through all of my favourites and relive my younger years, and that is the topic of today's video. My deliveries have been postponed. Some of my favourite go-to second-hand PC parts stores have been shut, so today it's all about the games, and the focus of the next 10 to 15 minutes will be seeing how well some of my favourite old games run on modern hardware. Sort of backwards to what we normally do. Instead of checking out how the hardware runs the games, we're checking out how the games run the hardware. So it's all well and good installing some of your favourite older titles onto your modern machine, but it isn't always as simple as just clicking play and enjoying it for what it is. There could be many modern compatibility issues, and some titles may refuse to start altogether. Hopes of achieving a crazy high frame rate don't always come to fruition, but I wanted to see how my Ryzen 5 1600 and Radeon 5700 XT build handles some of my favourite older titles. I also wanted to explore and talk about any limitations that I ran into, just in case you want to do the same yourselves. And it seems as though there is one common fix quite prominent throughout that you'll notice pop up when we test a lot of these older titles out. So let's get started with our first game, Morrowind. Released in the spring of 2002, I have the GOG version installed on my Ryzen 5 1600 and Radeon 5700 XT machine. Opening up the game launcher and equipping the Orion 8964 SkyQuest XX14G telescope allowed me to just about read through the configuration options. A little bit of scaling adjustment fixed this. Outside of the game, the graphical choices are limited, with the resolutions on offer being that of a 4:3 aspect ratio. The in-game menu lets us access a couple more options, including view distance and real-time shadows. With everything maxed out on my hardware, we're seeing well above 100 frames per second at the highest default resolution of 2048 by 1536. This gets closer to 250 during indoor segments. If you want to squeeze a few more frames out of Morrowind and don't mind sacrificing your eyeballs for the sake of a smoother experience, then turning things down to low should net you closer to 300 FPS. I don't believe the game is capped, and while this sounds great, it does mean that the frame drops, when they occur, are more noticeable. I then installed a free mod called MGEXE, which allows us to set higher resolutions, as well as enable longer view distances. This actually meant that we saw a few drops below 60 FPS in busier areas, though indoor environments will be unaffected. At 4K with 16 times anti-aliasing and anisotropic filtering, the game looks awesome, but the frame rate certainly takes a hit. Mafia, also a 2002 title, allows native 4K right out of the box, though the absolute highest settings are a no-go thanks to a flickering shadow issue that can be resolved by setting them to low. Honestly, it doesn't look too different graphically. The more noticeable aspects of this aging title include the 63 FPS frame cap and the poor draw distance, which these days just doesn't cut it. Installing the Mafia widescreen fix allows us to customize this, and as you can see, while the MSI Afterburner overlay doesn't seem to agree with these changes, distant vistas are now visible and the performance hasn't been impacted, at least not with these specs. I think this one still holds up very well as far as looks are concerned. In fact, it's still an all-round excellent title that I strongly recommend playing. This next classic needs no introduction. If you weren't entirely sure of the name, then even the cursor has you covered. Before Red Dead 2 achieved the title of the best Western, this was a strong contender in an albeit admittedly rather untouched market. Because this is a PS2 port, it's capped natively at 30 frames per second, which doesn't feel great to play with PC controls. Don't get me wrong, 30 is fine for me in some situations, but here it just feels very clunky and jittery. We're also limited to a maximum resolution of 1600 by 1200. Back in 2006 this would have been the norm, and I think this was even an Xbox 360 launch title. In fact, yeah, I remember vaguely opening this game on Christmas morning or something and having a lot of fun with it. Applying yet another widescreen fix lets us play in 4K 16:9, but there is still no benefit to uncapping the frame rate because the game will just run faster. This is the result of the game being ported straight from console. This issue can also be observed in games like Fallout 3 for example, where uncapping the frame rate just gives us more issues. Again, I'd recommend giving this one a try as it is very fun, despite not having aged all that well. Still, if you like westerns, then it's definitely worth having a go with this. When it came to the Steam version of Far Cry 2004's original release of the now much loved franchise, we needed to make no adjustments in order to play the game at 2160p or any widescreen resolution for that matter. There was a slight issue on startup, and that was the fact that it took about 15 minutes to get into the game. The initial loading screen took about 10 minutes to get past, and it felt like a freeze to be honest, but I went and made a cup of tea with what is, I'm afraid to say, the last of the tea bags, and by the time I came back we were in. This game still looks very good. By today's standards it's not impressive in comparison to some of the best open world first person games out there, but considering it came out 16 years ago, I think it still holds up very, very well. And it gets bonus points for requiring no messing about with tweaks and fixes. Just bear in mind that it might take a week or so to load, but at the moment I'm sure a lot of you have more time than you usually would. Personally, San Andreas is my favourite GTA game, though Vice City takes second place. I'm also testing it instead of San Andreas because it exhibits more issues than its successor, and it's something I've also noticed with GTA 3. This is the Steam version of the game, and every time I play it I notice a few problems. Firstly, it does support 1080p and 4K, but the image is very stretched. More about that later. Secondly, while it does run with a stupidly high frame rate even at the highest settings, I found that you need to enable the 30 FPS cap in order to avoid issues. For example, cutscenes will take ages to load, cars will likely be very slow and often fail to reverse altogether, and the sensitivity of the camera is absurd. Thankfully, there is yet another widescreen fix available for this title, and I think it's also possible to change the frame rate cap to 60, but that seems to cause a few cutscene issues and speed problems too. I think the default 30 FPS is best. It's not ideal for everyone, I know, but it just means that the game works as it should. Finally, let's take a look at Half-Life 2. Again, by default, all of your favourite modern day resolutions are available, including 4K, and the game works perfectly and still, in my opinion, looks very good. There is, however, disappointingly, a 300 FPS cap in place. Unplayable. Who thought this was a good idea? Seriously though, it's not an inconvenience by any means. If you do want to remove it for whatever reason, then it's as easy as enabling the console in Steam and setting a new max FPS in game. This seems to have no adverse effect, but it probably is rather unnecessary. I then decided to go back and test another couple of games at their absolute lowest settings to see just how high the frame rate would go. Of course, the lower we go with the resolution, the higher the CPU load, and the higher we go, the higher the GPU load. This was just a handful of some older games that seemed to run fine on modern hardware. I always like testing out older games with modern hardware because it's interesting to see whether or not they'll work straight out of the box, especially considering Windows 10 can have a few issues with titles as well, even if your hardware is perfectly up to the job. I also think Nvidia's drivers are better at running older titles than AMD's. That's just my personal opinion, and it's something I seem to have found when playing through my older games collection. Hopefully one of my deliveries will turn up very soon, and in the next one we can test out another piece of hardware. But until then, stay safe, keep indoors, play through some of those older games, and just have a good time. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like on it. If you didn't, leave a dislike. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and hopefully I will see all of you in the next one.